Like I said, it's the type of stuff that they don't teach and talk about too much. But it's good that we're learning this today, and let a friend know about it. Next up, we want to introduce Betty Reid Soskin. She grew up in Cajun Creole African-American family that settled in the East Bay after the historic floods that devastated New Orleans in 1927. Betty attended local schools, graduating from Castlemount High School, and worked in Boilermakers A-36, a segregated union hall during World War II. She and her young husband, Mel Reid, founded a still existing small Berkeley music store, which you all should know about, Reid's Records, in 1945. You all know about that, right? Betty has since held positions as a staff member to the Berkeley City Council, as a field representative serving West Contra Costa County for 2 members of the California State Assembly. Did I get that right? Let me repeat that again. It sounded like I ran the sentences together. So Betty has since held positions as a staff member to a Berkeley City Council member and as a field representative serving for West Contra Costa County for 2 members of the California State Assembly. In 1995, she was named Woman of the Year by the California State Legislature. She is currently a park ranger for the Rosie, the Riveter World War II Home Front National Historic Park in Richmond. Can we give it up for Betty Reid?
Ah, there you are. I don't know how to follow the presentation you just heard, because so much of what I would have told you may have been embedded in that. Except that maybe I need to deal with my current life as a park ranger. Because that put me into a place that I never dreamed I would be. During 1941 to 1945, there was such a confusion in those of us who were in place, not those of us who had migrated to the East Bay or to California, but for the fact that we were in place with the world changing all around us. The city of Richmond, which is where the national park is that I'm serving, had a population of 23,000 people in 1941. That's not even a good basketball crowd. 23,000 people, and within 18 months, that city had a population of 108,000 people. There is now a population of 102,000. If you can get some sense of the scope of the change in the city of Richmond, you have a way of understanding what was happening throughout the entire country, throughout the entire Bay Area, the greater Bay Area, where we were growing exponentially. All of the systems were so strained that everything in our worlds had to undergo those changes. Not only that, but before the war, World War II, I'm sure that segregation existed because our parents had all come out of the South. But those of us who were in place were not numerous enough to have rules made against. So we were living pretty much where we wanted to. There were maybe 15 families east of Lake Merritt, all of whom knew each other. There were 6 kids of color in my graduating class at Castlemount High School. Can you imagine what we were going through? Not only that, but Henry Kaiser, who had 4 shipyards in Richmond alone, sent his recruiters out to the 5 southern states of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and brought into the Bay Area people who were black and white, who would not be sharing drinking fountains, or schools, or hospitals, of any public accommodations for another 20 years back in their places of origin. Set in place in the Bay Area, the complete system of racial segregation. Those people who had to be housed and clothed and work together accomplished the Herculean task of building 747 ships in the following 3 years and 8 months. That's what your heroic grandparents accomplished. 747 ships. One of those ships was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 23 minutes. These were sharecroppers, working under the leadership of a most extraordinary, ordinary industrialist who was an 8th grade dropout, who was a cement contractor who had never built a ship in his life. He believed that by applying the prefabrication techniques that Henry Ford had perfected in the automobile industry, that he could reduce the time of building a ship from 18 months to 2 years to that number of 747 ships. He did it. The Greater Bay Area became the nerve center for the war in the Pacific. Richmond and Henry Kaiser became the nerve center of that nerve center. At the time, he was not a social reformer. He was just a smart industrialist with a dream. He had to build the shipyards before he could build the ships because that was all wetlands. He accomplished his task and turned around the war with 98,000 people he'd imported here to do that task. I came into the picture as a field representative for Dion Arab at the time. And the only reason I was sitting at the table when this park was being planned was because this property under the Ford building, which was one of the sites designated in the legislation that declared this park's existence. The state owned the property because it had been built on air rights. I was seated at the table and being forced to think back on a period that I had passed through in such a confused state that I really could hardly remember it. It was such a revelation to me, and I couldn't really relate to the thought of a park being named for Rosie the Riveter. Because I knew Rosie as a white woman. We've all seen her. I can do it. The problem was that there is a story of Rosie the Riveter, a white woman, that needs to be told because it was emancipation of white women. But women of color had been working since slavery. The war did not emancipate anyone of us. At the time, my choices for employment would have been two. I could have worked in agriculture, or I could have been a domestic servant when I graduated from high school. I worked during the war in Jim Crow Union Hall because at that time unions weren't yet racially integrated. I knew that all black workers had trainee or helper on the union cards to keep them from being in competition for jobs when the war ended. I knew that the pay scale was less than for white workers. I could not afford to do much remembering of that period because it was hurtful. I knew as a field rep at that first meeting when I was watching a presentation of the superintendent of the parks, where they were lining out the plans for this park and all of the sites, the scattered sites throughout the Richmond that were designated to define this park. I remember it as places of segregation. Atherton Village, where black people could not live. Eastern Village, where people could not live. The Maritime Child Development Center, which was really the beginnings of Head Start. It did not service black families. I knew that this was not my story. And if this park, which was going to be paid for with from national treasure that belonged to me, was going to enshrine sites that I recognized as places of segregation, then someone needed to know that. Because I didn't know that there was any evil. There weren't any villains in this piece. I looked around at faces that didn't remember. Except that there was only one other couple in that room watching that presentation who were African American. And I suddenly realized that I wasn't the only one that didn't feel connected to this national park. And that something had to be done before we made a terrible mistake. And I began to work with the people who were making the park. I knew the GI Bill, which was guaranteed to give every returning veteran an education and the guarantee of a mortgage, was legislated locally instead of federally, so that if a black veteran came back and the school he wanted to attend was not segregated, he might do that. But the local banker had it in his power to determine whether or not you could get a mortgage with a GI Bill. There were such incredible injustices that had been passed over in a period that was, we were too busy building those 747 ships to take the time to process the changes that were happening. It became a crusade for me because I needed to be seated at those tables, not for the reasons that had originally been assigned to me, but because I knew that this part was very, very important. That I know, because I'm in my 89th year, I know that change is an irresistible force. And that we're all a part of it, not only by what we do, but by what we don't do, that we do then change. And because my great-grandmother was born into slavery in 1846 in Welcome Post Office, St. James Parish, Louisiana. She was born in 1846, died in 1948, when I was 27 years old, mother of 2 children, and I knew my slave ancestor. She raised my mother, who was born in 1894 and died in 1995 at 101. In the lifetime of 3 black women, there is slavery and Reconstruction and stopover Manzetti and lynchings and Brown versus the Board of Education and little girls being bombed in Birmingham and the March on Washington, and all of that happened in the lifetime of 3 black women. And on January 20th, in 2009, I sat on the Capitol Mall watching the inauguration of our first black president with a picture of my slave ancestor in my pocket.